A little bit about me. Mike mentioned that I did have a musical past. I was a musician for about 20 years, a little bit longer, although I maybe use that term very loosely. I wasn't a classically trained musician or anything like that. I played in rock and roll bands and some punk rock bands and things like that. But I suppose maybe my interest in nightlife and nightclubs probably was fed during that period. And as far back as I really can remember, I was always fascinated about some of the clubs in Vancouver, and particularly somebody asked me one time, if you had a time machine, what would you want to go back to? And I often said, going back to just when I was not 19 and over to get into some of these places, or because some of these places were around when I was a kid, you know, when my legs would have been swinging under the chair, but I would have loved to have seen some of these places. So it's been a long-standing interest, even probably from the 1990s, being interested in some of these places. And some of the great names. Clubs today don't have some of those great names, you know, Oil Can Harry's and places like this. You know, they call nightclubs now such sort of frou-frou VIP sounding places, and they've missed some of the zeal and some of the great names that they used to name nightclubs back then. There's so much in the beginning to sort of address in terms of Vancouver nightclub history, to talk about the prehistory of nightclubs. About 100 years ago, really things began to change in the city, particularly in terms of the fact that cabarets started happening around 1919, 1920, as I say, 100 years ago. But before that, of course, we had saloons. And saloons were fairly wild places. I mean, everybody has the typically sort of Western movie idea of the piano player sitting in the corner playing Camptown Races or something like this. And in reality, things were a little bit different. Now, they were wild places. They were open 24 hours a day in Vancouver, and this is in the 1910 eras and prior to that, 1880s, 1890s in Vancouver. But these were very sort of divided places. Vancouver, of course, as many of you know here, I won't sort of need to spell it all, every segment of the history here, but from 1917 to 1921, we did have prohibition here in British Columbia. And in many cases, the saloons were connected later to beer parlors that had to do after that period were somewhat of a post-saloon era and whatnot. I want to jump ahead really right into the nightclub era, because unless you're 120 years old, we don't really need to cover this stuff because you wouldn't have had a chance to go to these places. But I wanted to just sort of touch on and say how things were different. The main thing that I wanted to stress was that, you know, when cabarets opened up, there was now a place. It used to be that you used to sort of go to 3 different places. You went to a restaurant or a cafe to eat, you went to a theater to see a show, and you went to a saloon or later a beer parlor to drink. With the cabarets coming together, and in many ways this was sort of returning servicemen from the First World War, coming back from Europe, who had seen the nightclubs and the cabarets of France, where everything was on sale and everything was provided, that many of them came back and thought, what's such a great idea for here? And that changing mores and changing times, and also that attitude, I think had something to do with it. But saloons, this was the Boulder Saloon, which is at about 1 West Cordova. There's now that restaurant there called Bunkhouse. So that building is still there. Some of these buildings are still here. We have this idea that all the buildings of these nightclubs are gone. Sometimes there's something else now. Well, we'll get right to the cave, because in many ways the cave sort of symbolizes, if there's one nightclub that we miss, overall, even that evokes a sense of nightclub nostalgia more than any place else, even to those who never went there, that was the cave at 626 Hornby Street. The interior, of course, had that sort of great stalactite and stalagmite And there was actually a few different caves. There was a cave in Winnipeg and a cave in another one in Alberta, in Edmonton, I think it was, right, Tom? Yeah. So it was a chain, but we, of course, maybe know the Vancouver cave, of course, the best. And the cave opens up in the 30s. It was there. It finally was demolished in '81, but it had a very long life and sort of saw a very long period of nightclub entertainment. It also did have some competition in the form of the Palomar, 713 Burrard Street, just at Burrard and Alberni. And the Palomar was a very big place, actually, about the size of the Commodore. And in turn, it had its own entertainment. Sandy DeSantis was a very well-known orchestra leader at a bunch of different places, going back to, I think, to the Vienna Cafe, but, which was down on Main Street, which I'll get to later, but was the band leader at the Palomar for many years, and then later a co-owner of that. And of course, the Palomar had its own entertainment too. Jerry Colonna from the Bob Hope Show. This is a poster actually from my friend Tom Carter, who's here on the board of the VHS. This photograph in a way doesn't do it justice because this poster is very bright. And Tom was telling me we couldn't figure out in the beginning why it was so bright. Well, it wasn't necessarily a poster you'd see on a light pole. They didn't necessarily always happen that bend like you see them today. But and it's also a fairly large size. This poster was on the front of a streetcar, a Vancouver streetcar. So presumably as the streetcars went through the mists of Vancouver streets, this would jump out at you very easily, and this is how they sometimes advertised shows back then. The Mills Brothers, of course, also a very popular act, played the cave as well. And getting back to the cave, the Palomar closed about 1953. I go into some of the details of that actually in Liquor, Lust, and the Law, my book about the Penthouse, because the Filipponi family was associated with the ownership of that place. But the litany of different kinds of shows and different kinds of music that you could see at the cave was really remarkable. When the list of entertainers that went through that building over the years is just astounding. Johnny Rivers, and what immediately interested me was the whimsical Kirby Chimps. I would have gone to see the Chimps just alone. In fact, I had to do some research on the Chimps. And the Kirby Chimps were well, just as you see it. I don't know how, but that picture sort of tells 1,000 words, doesn't it? I read an interview with Mr. Kirby there in the hat. He was British, but his wife was from Cleveland apparently, and he talked about how the Chimps usually only had sort of enough star power for about 5 to 7 years, because he said in the interview after about that time they get lazy and fat. And they're not interested in entertaining anymore. So I guess that's show business for you, after all. But and as I say, right in the 1960s, late 60s, at the cave. So you have this great sort of wide sort of gamut of entertainment going from some of the post-vaudeville days all the way up until as I say into the 70s. And one of the great sort of figures about the cave was this man, Jack Wasserman, a columnist. Many people, of course, in this audience will know that name and would have read his columns when he was alive. He was a real chronicler of that Hornby Street nightclub strip. There were so many different clubs on Hornby Street. It's all gone now, of course, but mixed in later with Gary Taylor's and Misty's, all these number of clubs that were down on Hornby Street. It was really sort of what Granville Street is today, by contrast. I'll read a little excerpt from the book, actually, just in terms of that, and in terms of Wasserman, which sort of speaks to maybe some of that legacy. In 1977, at the age of 50, after more than 5 years as an overall gadabout on his beat along Hornby Street, Wasserman died while giving a speech at the Hotel Vancouver. Hornby is a different street now in a different city. On a late evening, any night of the week, a few patrons might be seen at the corner of Hornby and Dunsmuir, stepping out for a cigarette from the Blackbird Public House or Brandy's Show Lounge, but otherwise the sidewalks of Hornby between Georgia and Pender are quiet. High Steakhouse is the only business left from the old days, but 2 flickering fake candles twinkle outside its door past 11 p.m. There are no enticing neon signs or doormen on the street ushering you into the pleasures of the nightclubs inside. Only a few lonely taxi cabs glide by, heading to and from more exciting destinations. There's nothing to indicate this short stretch of the city came to be entertained at the Cave and other thriving clubs. The sights and sounds of Vancouver nightlife have moved elsewhere, and late at night on its lonely sidewalk, Jack Wasserman, his face, stares out on a quiet Hornby Street with no one to talk to. For those who are not familiar, there's a plaque with Jack Wasserman's place down there. Now, of course, Wasserman wasn't the only character before or since Vancouver nightclubs. These two gentlemen, Izzy and Richie Walters, ran a place at 1136 West Georgia called Izzy's Supper Club. If the Cave was really sort of the show lounge of a great time, Izzy's was its kind of somewhat raffish little brother, maybe, and especially in terms of size. The place was a little smaller, and later on, for those of you who may be more rock and roll fans, it became a place called Outlaws before it burned down as the Metro in around 89, I think it was, 89, 90. But there were so many different kind of shows that, of course, as music changed and whatnot. Stevie Wonder in 1967, the Everly Brothers, 68, Dusty Springfield, that was also 1968. There's a great story in the book about Dusty punching Izzy Walters, actually. But I'll let you read that from the book if you want. And Cannonball, some of the jazz music starts to also come in, as well as, you know, R&B and whatnot. What this sort of created in town was really a great circuit for between just a few clubs within a very short space of places downtown, where a number of musicians were working. You know, you had full orchestras working at the Cave, at Izzy's, certainly, you know, over at some other places in town, down at the Marco Polo later on, which I'll get to. But what it was an incredible benefit for musicians because you were working every night. Many times these stars would come in just with a band leader or maybe one accompanist that would be sort of the musical director, and in the afternoon they would rehearse the show 2 times. Blaine Tringham, who's a trumpeter who was a regular at the Cave and at Izzy's and a few other clubs, told me about they would, you know, have about a 3-hour rehearsal a day, and they would do the show at night. All sheet music, different shows. Sometimes, of course, the shows were in town for a week or a week engagement, but it gave regular musicians and regular players that, you know, these guys were buying houses back when Vancouver homes were cheap and whatnot, because they were working so much. And what you had was really sort of top quality Vancouver musicians that were some of the best really on the West Coast. It was very common that, of course, Mitzi Gaynor came to the Cave to rehearse a show, and Vancouver became known as Tune-Up City. This goes back to the vaudeville days when so many shows would begin their tours in Vancouver and then head south. And what's interesting is, of course, they didn't necessarily always go east. So Vancouver was always blessed with a certain amount of entertainment that the rest of the city never got to see. Or pardon me, the rest of the country always never got to see, excuse me. And that really made for something special and unique going on here in Vancouver that, as I say, you know, often the case, sometimes they would tour, especially later on as some of the more clubs along the prairies and out to Ontario. And certainly they'd go up to Toronto if they were on the East Coast. But we were really sort of blessed with our geographical, placing here in Vancouver. And we were, as we say, very spoiled that way. Of course, while things are happening, in the downtown core, elsewhere over on the east side, at the New Delhi, which is at 544 Main Street, there were other kind of clubs happening. Places that offered different kinds of entertainment, necessarily that sometimes always that had been the case at some of the more sort of downtown central clubs. The New Delhi had been the Venice Cafe in the 1920s, and then after that in the Log Cabin Inn in the 1940s, which was a predominantly black club. Later on, around 55 or early 50s, it becomes the Hindustan Cafe, owned by South Asian partners. Later, mostly J.R. Shorey, who was the father of Tab Shorey from a band called the High Fives, one of Vancouver's very early sort of rock bands, and kind of began a network where some of the more up-and-coming younger players and musicians could also find a place as well. Typically, there would be an exotic dancer as part of Vancouver has a long history of exotic dancers and burlesque, of course. And typically there would be, the band would play an instrumental set, the dancer would come on, do a show, and then there'd often be an MC telling very, very bad jokes, even worse than mine tonight. And later on the band would do another set that would be songs that they'd clear away some of the tables and you could dance to. So you got sort of a floor show, you got maybe something to eat. Now, of course, you couldn't drink in any of these places still because there were no liquor licenses per se. So this goes back to the old days of the bottle clubs, and that term that many people here are probably familiar with, where you had to bring your own booze in and maybe a teapot would be provided and you can pour some of your liquor in there. And it looked like everybody was having a tea party even though their words were being slurred. And we have an attitude that sometimes we think that it must have been very sort of urbane and well-mannered and whatnot. Well, I don't know about you, but when I'm pouring my own drinks, I maybe get a little drunk faster than normally than a bartender serving me would, so I'm sure the party's got a little of a hand at times. Another place of that, just around the corner, the Smiling Buddha, is a big one, and there's a lot of material in the book about the Smiling Buddha. Of course, this man figures quite highly into our story and through Vancouver nightclub history. Does anybody, we don't say it if you know who he is, somebody putting their hand up in the back. He's the man in the yellow cardigan there when he was in Bobby Taylor and the Vancouvers, but it's the one and only Mr. Tommy Chong, who I was fortunate enough to interview for the book, because while most people know his comedy career, Tommy Chong was a very sort of central player in Vancouver nightclub history, and especially in the mid-1960s when he moved here from Calgary with his band and then got other bands going here. Between him and his brother Stan, who's kind of the forgotten sort of hero in this, in Tommy's story to a certain degree, they both began to sort of manage clubs as well, and because Tommy was often playing in them, he was roping in other bands. So not only was Tommy sort of sitting in with other groups and forming his own sort of own scene in Vancouver, he was hiring other musicians and whatnot, and because of that, Chong becomes quite a central sort of hub for a while. This is before his comedy career, as I say. In about 1963, the Alma Theater, which was over at 3719 Alma, we're about where that sort of, I guess it's on the northwest corner of Alma and sort of 10th there, I guess, or 9th. There was the old Alma Theater. This is the theater had been around in the 20s, and it was kind of on its last legs by the 1960s. And Chong and some partners went in and leased the place to call it the Blues Palace. Now this poster calls it the Blues Place. That was a misprint. But they went down to Seattle and met a booking agent there. They managed to find somebody that could contact Ike and Tina Turner, who were doing a West Coast tour, and he booked the band for $750 and brought them up for their very first appearance. This was before a very notable Danceland appearance. Danceland was another dance hall down at Burrard, just off Robson Street. And it's interesting because immediately, of course, we're talking about Point Grey, immediately when some of these shows started happening and Chong started bringing in some of these rowdy blues acts and R&B acts, the neighborhood immediately began to get upset. Not just the noise and whatnot, but the amount of different people that it brought to that area of Kitts/Kerrisdale. I guess it's sort of on the border there. I grew up a little bit sort of south of there, so. And it's interesting to read some of the newspaper reports of the day. Chong himself, gosh, you know, for all the weed that guy smoked, he has a great memory, I gotta tell you. The interview that I did with him, he remembered so many of these names, and it was kind of fun after a while. I could tell he was really enjoying himself when we had a chance to talk, that as I dropped some of these names further on him of some of these old nightclub people, he was like, oh yes, I remember, and he in turn actually helped me with some of the research for the book that way. It was very kind of him. But this show in particular brought a lot of people, a lot of African-American airmen up from Whidbey Air Force Base. And the neighborhood immediately, you can't necessarily tell from the newspaper reports of the time, aside from some of this disruption of noise or, you know, broken bottles in the neighborhood or, you know, people having sex in people's gardens in Dunbar and stuff like that. Very much like the Kerrisdale Arena shows in the early 1980s, if you remember why those got shut down. Same kind of thing. It's interesting though that Chong and other people told me that some of the reason behind that was because some of the parents of the neighborhood there thought a lot of, especially all these Americans coming up to see these R&B shows, were a little too close in proximity to Our Lady of Perpetual Help Catholic Girls' School. And that sort of fed some of the reason why not. Whereas Chong was a fairly enterprising guy in the nightclub scene, no matter what, you know, the city shutting down some of his clubs, he managed to reopen other places, and some other places that were quite successful, like the Elegant Parlor at 1024 Davie, and also T's Cabaret, a little bit more of a short-lived place on Pender, and later on the space behind the Shanghai Junk, where he met Cheech Marin, and they started Cheech and Chong. There were other people that are perhaps evocative of some of the people that were involved in Vancouver nightclub history. Not everybody necessarily was on the up and up. The Bunkhouse, which is still there, that building is still there at 612 Davie, which is right at the corner of Seymour and Davie. A few years ago it was called the Atlantic Trap and Gill, for those of you who might remember that. I played there when it was in. But it was a folk club. It was interesting as a folk club because it had some, this was actually a poster from they did a recording there, a famous blues album that was actually recorded live at the Bunkhouse with Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee. It was sort of hit Vancouver right at that time where, as I say, some of the exotic dancing was happening, and while it was a folk club, it also had topless waitresses, which seems very, and I've got some pictures of it. I didn't include this because I wasn't sure maybe we would have any kids in the audience tonight and I'd get bawled out for it. So I left it out, but you can see it in the book. And it looks very sort of sad and depressing, you know, there's sort of a bunch of guys sitting around eating chicken sandwiches and fries and there's just a topless waitress serving them. It just, you sort of think, what's the point? But these were different days, you know, like then. In terms of who, the organizer, the guy who ran this place was a guy by the name of Les Stork. Now, Les Stork's a fairly fascinating guy in Vancouver nightclub history. Very colorful guy. He had formerly been a boxer, and in the, I think he'd been in the Canadian Army, did a stint in the Canadian Army for a bit, and he opened the Bunkhouse, basically ran it himself. He was the server, host, took reservations, emceed the shows, and whatnot. Quite a character. And I'll read a little bit about, after a few years in the nightclub business, Stork began to sort of associate with some of the Vancouver underworld. Some of the people actually name in Liquor Less Than the Law. It connects with some of those people. And Stork started drinking too much, drugs start coming in the picture with him, and the whole business shuts down. I'll read a little excerpt from the book on that. With his business in ruins and his family in tatters, Stork only fell further. He relocated to Toronto for a short time, but returned to Vancouver in a characteristically headline-making fashion. In 1973, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police had become suspicious of a Land Rover, a boat, and a trailer that arrived in Toronto from Europe. The RCMP tailed the vehicles all the way from their final destination, Surrey, a suburb just south of Vancouver. Police arrested the two men who were there to meet the vehicles, as well as the man who had driven the Land Rover across the country, Les Stork. The RCMP inspected the vehicles in Toronto before Stork picked them up and found 280 pounds of hashish hidden in the boat, which they replaced with sand. The approximately $700,000 worth of hash Stork thought he'd successfully transported to Vancouver was in fact Toronto dirt. Stork was sentenced to 8 years in Kingston Penitentiary and only served 2, thanks to a technicality raised during appeal, but this would not be his last run on the law. He actually tried it a few years later as well, and also tried to get the Bunkhouse running a couple of years later, but it didn't work out. But for those few short years, the Bunkhouse was sort of the talk of the town with some of the acts and some of the goings-on there. Oh, there's a picture of Les in less happier days when he's a mugshot from him. Thanks to the Vancouver Police Museum for digging that one out for me. He looks like he's had a little bit harder life than the previous photo. While there were people, of course, like Stork, there were also other people involved in some other clubs, Danny Basita, which I'll talk about here, with Oil Can Harry's. At 726 Thurlow, that's where Oil Cans was. And Basita himself was, it remains sort of an interesting figure. I had tried to contact him. Some of his family lives here in town. After his years being involved with Oil Can Harry's, he later ran for mayor here in Vancouver and got, I think, maybe just over 1,200 votes or something, but he eventually left, and then he's really never, while he's come back in and out of town for some family events, he's been very secretive, and I've heard all sorts of things, that everything there's an interior shot of Oil Cans. They're great, I had a lot of great entertainment there too. And there's Danny Basita on the left, along with Frank Hook, a cousin who was involved in the business with him. But Basita and Hook were only about 25 years old when they got the club going. I don't know anybody 25-year-olds who are able to get clubs going today in Vancouver, as much as they want to. But it just goes to show how sort of wide open the whole business was in a certain sense. And some of the people that were involved with it, you know, you didn't necessarily need a lot of experience in business to start a club in Vancouver. So this sort of feeds some of the, as I say, some of the characters that are woven in and out of the story and whatnot. As I say, with Basita, as much as I tried to track him down, and I'd heard everything that he's involved with a motorcycle gang to making exotic films, he didn't want to talk to me, and maybe he just, after some experiences in Vancouver, and perhaps the way that Oil Can Harry's ended for him, and later Basita's, his club on Hastings Street, I don't know whether he just thought, I'm done with Vancouver, or maybe there's some creditors here still looking for him. I honestly don't know. I'd love to talk to him someday. I hope if he reads the book, he'll be able to understand sort of where I was coming from with it. But jumping down to Chinatown now. This is Victor Louis at the Marco Polo, which was at 90 East Pender. You know, we have sometimes this attitude, or sometimes we only think of the clubs that were owned essentially by Caucasian, European descent, but there are many clubs, as I say, from like the New Delhi and of course the Marco Polo, that were owned by, you know, it was a very multicultural industry in its own way. And I don't know necessarily if the same can be said for other cities in Western Canada that can maybe hold those bragging rights. The great thing about the Marco Polo is that there were, of course, yes, there was Chinese food available, and apparently very tasty Chinese food. Anybody I know who's ever eaten there. But also, and this is, I'll speak of this in a moment, but also you could see shows, which we'll jump ahead to that one. And this picture here to sort of get some idea of some of the size. But I want to jump back to this photo, actually just here, if you can see, back when, this is interesting for a number of ways, you can see the Marco Polo there, which is about today where the Vancouver Film School building down in Chinatown is, if you know where that is. That's just along Columbia and Pender, I guess it would be, on that side. And of course, when False Creek went all the way really up to Columbia Street, I can guarantee you there are scientists being paid by very big real estate companies right now to invent a time machine to go back before False Creek was filled in from Main Street to Clark Drive, because there are a lot of real estate agents that could just picture all the waterfront property that was lost when False Creek was filled in like that. But I love the change in False Creek, and really the change that is one of the biggest sort of changes that ever happened in the city of Vancouver. We sometimes forget about it because it's been so long. The plan to change that started in about 1905 and ended around the time of the First World War, when the creek was filled in. This area here was filled in about 1965. But you can see also perhaps lends some idea to that part of town and what it's like for those of you who maybe don't remember it or weren't around back then. When the Marco Polo closed, so much of the story of Vancouver nightclubs are places opening and closing after, you know, sometimes only 10 years. Cave was around a long time. ISY'S was around a little longer. That building was around quite longer after ISY'S closed in the mid-70s. But in the early 80s, when some of these places like the Cave closes 81, when the Marco Polo closes 82, it seems like that sort of signaled a change in some of the attitudes that we have around. I'll read a little excerpt here. Marco Polo continued to function as a popular restaurant for a few more years, but moved to North Vancouver in spring of 1982. When the Marco Polo closed in Chinatown, it seemed to mark the end of a unique time in history for Vancouver nightlife, especially for those who had been moved by the performances they'd seen in the club, like Denny Boyd, the columnist from The Sun, who had been impressed beyond words by the Nina Simone show in March 1968 and believed the Marco Polo closing after the closure of the Cave a year before really marked the end of an era. Boyd delivered a passionate eulogy for the Marco Polo and the Vancouver Sun, lamenting how quickly the city had changed and expressing cautious optimism about what he thought the city was where he thought the city was heading. Pardon me. It wasn't too long ago this city was nightclub city, he wrote. You could go downtown with a $20 bill in your pocket and see a class act. Uptown we got the major acts at Cave and ISY'S, and downtown we got the new acts, plus golden coin beef and steamed broccoli at the Marco Polo. Talent broke at the Marco Polo. The bad ones are forgotten, but some went on to stardom. They were new, they were hungry, and they worked hard at the Marco Polo, and they respected your entertainment dollar. It was a fun place, and there aren't any fun places left. Maybe I'm missing something. Maybe Vancouver doesn't want to chuckle anymore. Maybe the climate's too wet and the economy's too dry for laughing. All I know is I never saw a bank tower I liked. It's funny, you could almost take that same column and print it today, and some people would say it's the case. Or it's still, meant to show a picture of Alex McGilvery, who recently just passed, columnist who was, if Wasserman had his beat at the Cave, surely Alex, his standing reservation was down at the Marco Polo. And there's a picture of Denny Boyd, along with Ross Filipponi in the middle there, and Emil Hirsch, who was a football player, Crazy Legs Hirsch. I just stuck that in because it's a picture of Denny Boyd, and also it's a picture of Ross Filipponi, and the Filipponi family appreciates it when I post a picture of them. The Inquisition was an interesting club, mid-1960s. Inquisition is a great example of how it took some of the people who were involved in the nightclub business really had to be gamblers, or they really needed a gambler's instinct to operate a club. Some shows you'd think, wow, geez, people are going to come down for this, it's going to be great. Nobody shows up. Otherwise, you pay too much money for them, and then you're in a hole. Next time, this act that you don't think is going to come through, do any business, suddenly it's sold out. That push and pull, that mathematic, that calculus is still very much a part of the nightclub industry today in terms of any booking act. My friend Mo down at the back there, who runs the Rickshaw Theater, would probably agree with that sentiment. Howie Bateman, who ran the Inquisition, who booked Miles Davis to perform at the Inquisition in 1963, that's a great example of it. The Miles Davis show was just a couple years before. Davis had recorded Kinda Blue, that landmark Miles Davis record. The jazz scene in itself in Vancouver was quite small then. Of course, Miles Davis today came back, he'd fill an arena or something, but in the last few years of his life, he was playing big theaters, Queen Elizabeth Theater and stuff like this. But the Inquisition was a very small club, less than 100 people. And Bateman kind of ran the Inquisition as sort of his own fiefdom, and he probably knew that he was going to lose some money, but without any liquor to sell and only selling coffee, since it was technically really a coffee house, and some pizza that he was making in the back by himself, there was no way that really that show could have made money. But Bateman was a very enterprising guy. In serious debt, Bateman made a considerable gamble. That year, Theatre Under the Stars, or Tuts, which staged productions at the Malkin Bowl in Stanley Park, were in a contract dispute with the venue's management and left. After negotiating a cheap fee from the Vancouver Park Board, Bateman announced that he would put on Huts, Hootenanny Under the Stars, on the evening of July 30th, 1963. This is just a couple months after the Miles Davis thing, so he's now trying to make his money back. On the showcase bill were the Milestones, Karen James, Ed McCurdy, Bill Roberts, and the Jubilation Singers, and 10 other folk acts. Bateman, again defying logic and conventional business sense, charged just $1 for admission. It was cloudy on the day of the concert, and it looked like it might rain. If the show had to be canceled or was even poorly attended because of bad weather, Bateman faced certain disaster. So he devised a backup plan. If the rain came, he would move the concert indoors of the Queen Elizabeth Theater. Theater manager Ian Dobbin gave Bateman a considerable break. He didn't have to put up any money or make a final decision until 3 o'clock that day. At 2 o'clock, the sun came out. Relieved, Bateman phoned Dobbin to tell him he wouldn't need the theater. But practically just as he soon put the phone down, the skies darkened again at 3 o'clock, and a deluge of rain came down. Bateman went in and hid an apartment and was physically ill, Jack Wasserman noted in his column. With no alternative, Bateman and a group of friends went down to the Malkin Bowl, sloshed water out of the chairs, kept their fingers crossed, and waited for the sight to gradually dry out. He must have thought divine intervention had happened when the sun again parted the skies. And an hour or two later, nearly 5,000 people showed up, attracted by the can't-lose price of admission, leaving another 2,500 people without tickets stranded at the entrance of Stanley Park, with traffic backed up 4 blocks along Georgia Street. With the debt of the Miles Davis show now partly paid, Bateman had attempted to dig further out of the hole by booking American singer-songwriter, actor, and civil rights activist Josh White to perform at the Queen Elizabeth Theater. But Bateman's plans were again disrupted, this time by far worse than a rainstorm. The Josh White show was scheduled for November 22nd, 1963, the day U.S. President Kennedy was assassinated. Local movie houses and restaurants closed upon learning the news. Children were sent home early from school, and the entertainment at the Queen Elizabeth Theater was canceled too. That afternoon, as were Bateman's hopes of a breadwinning concert, that afternoon, as were Bateman's hopes of a breadwinning concert, pardon me. The last nail in the Inquisition's coffin came a week later, immediately following the conclusion of the Canadian Football League's Championship Grey Cup game between the Hamilton Tiger Cats and hometown BC Lions. The Lions were defeated, and then hordes of rowdy, disappointed fans ran amok and clashed with police in the streets of downtown Vancouver. In the wake of that incident, many people avoided the city's core, and local businesses took a considerable hit, leaving a broken Howie Bateman to close the Inquisition in December 1963. He never did make back the money from the Miles Davis booking, but as with any veteran gambler, his luck changed. Bateman would depart Vancouver for Toronto, where he found success in magazine publishing and staging theatrical productions. There's no hint of where the Inquisition once stood. The towering glass skyscraper of the Telus Garden Communications Building takes up the whole block at Seymour and Georgia Streets, where the little coffee house once stood. But the venue was the talk of the town for a while, and even remembered by the musician who was often blamed for killing it. Vancouver Sun columnist Bob Smith noted, whenever Miles Davis happened to meet people from Vancouver, he would somewhat sheepishly ask, Have you ever heard of the Inquisition Coffee House? Well, I closed it down in 1 week. While some places are in Vancouver seemingly just sort of flashes in the pan, there are others, remarkably, who have stood the test of time. There's some clubs that go for decades, seem to be able to operate against changing music styles, changing attitudes, old crowds leaving, new ones coming in. And that's not just the Commodore Ballroom or the Penthouse nightclub. At 1024 Davie Street, there was the Leicester Court Ballroom, which later is the Embassy Ballroom, and which is after that the Retinal Circus, and is now Celebrities. Essentially, that building has been consistently used as an entertainment venue since 1914, which is quite remarkable, especially downtown where the city's changed so much. I want to get. Let's get. I think we have time here. We've got time here to do something on the Zanzibar, because while the Zanzibar is not necessarily remembered as one of the great venues in Vancouver, it certainly is one of the most colorful. And the Zanzibar was down at 1129 House Street. It had previously been the Torch Cabaret, and later Diamond Jim's, run by Jim Wisby. And he sold the place in the early 1970s. I'll read a little excerpt from the book that hope to find from it, and we'll continue to the end here. From the start, Club Zanzibar was a different kind of nightclub. It scrapped the comedy and floor shows. It also scrapped the R&B bands and replaced them with a simple live combo. But this house band would not provide music for patrons to dance to. The music would accompany a whole other kind of entertainment that went with the club's new business direction. Readers of the January 18th, 1971 edition of The Province, which is, oh, that's, pardon me, just written right here, yeah, would certainly have noticed that day's headline about two armed gunmen who held up the front desk at the Ritz Hotel, but it was a small advertisement in the corner of page 2 that raised more eyebrows. The Zanzibar announced topless wrestling. See it to believe it. Topless dancers trained to kick, maul, punch, eye gouge, and hair pull, assuring customers that the evening would be, quote-unquote, zany, wacky, hilarious, and violent. The ad was accompanied by a small black and white photo of two women wrestling. The reaction was immediate. Exotic dancing wasn't new to Vancouver, but this was a different kind of exhibition altogether. Columnist Alan Fotheringham tackled the subject in his column in the Vancouver Sun the following day. There are those parochial critics among us who contend that Vancouver is lacking in the avant-garde and sadly deficient of the cultural breakthroughs that mark more progressive centers. They, carping complainers, obviously did not catch the ad on page 2 of The Province yesterday. Fotheringham said that he had called Club Zanzibar to find out more and chatted with an anonymous spokesman who noted that the management had previously, quote-unquote, tested the act for audience appreciation at the Golf Club on Hastings Street, which was under the same management. There are a few things that had to be worked out before putting them to a more critical audience, the spokesman told Fotheringham, leaving the columnist to remark the man sounded like a theater director about to move a new act from New Haven to Broadway. One never knew the typewriter salesman and the stock hustlers of Howe Street rated so high in the pantheon of noon-hour buffets, Fotheringham wrote. The students of foreign culture will recall the girls wrestling in mud on the Reeperbahn in Hamburg. Can Howe Street compare? Wednesday's opening with the violent Baron of Beef snapping at the customers will tell. It was probably the Zanzibar's young owner, Marty Reutemann, who spoke to Fotheringham that day. A graduate of Vancouver Sir Winston Churchill Secondary School and a former sailor in the Canadian Navy, Reutemann seemed to enjoy creating an aura of controversy around himself. His nightclub operating company, which he dubbed the Syndicate, which included the Zanzibar, the Golf Club, and the OK Corral in New Westminster, had a distinctly seedy reputation that some people saw as a playful put-on, with Reutemann playing up his role as a sleazy nightclub owner. Others took him more seriously, however, and thought he might have a legitimate connection to organized crime. Either way, the Zanzibar had cut such a furor, the club suddenly was the talk of the town. The controversy forced Reutemann himself to step forward with a letter to the editor in the Vancouver Sun the following week. With regard to the topless wrestling I put on at the Club Zanzibar, he wrote, I would like to inform your readers in order to call a halt to the barrage of telephone calls we received from quote-unquote irate women, that it is definitely not an obscene performance. Reutemann probably viewed the letter as another opportunity for free publicity. Subtly dropping the name of one of his other nightclubs in the letter, he wrote, I have carefully trained 5 ex-strip teasers at afternoon rehearsals at the Golf Club to put on a very entertaining and humorous act. Nothing more. The girls in the midget, billed as 1 mad dog and 5 chicks, have been selected carefully in regards to the law of the land. Interestingly enough, It is the women in the audience who yell and cheer the loudest. A month later, Reutemann doubled down, and the syndicate ran an advertisement for Club Zanzibar that welcomed nurses, stewardesses, waitress, maids, secretaries, and beauty parlor attendants to join the cast of entertainers at the club, assuring patrons that a whole new crew of girls replaced the topless wrestlers currently undergoing treatment at hospital for bodily injuries. That didn't stop there. Reutemann also showcased a 300-pound stripper by the name of U.C. Moore at the Zanzibar. Even some male performers got up on stage, first at a luncheon featuring a demonstration by local weightlifter Joe Hing, and then for a karate demonstration during another topless wrestling night. Listings in the local classified section that called for young girls and midgets only added to the wild reputation of the Zanzibar. In a candid interview with the Vancouver Sun, Reutemann offered some insight into how he envisioned his life unfolding. Knowing your future is not a blessing. Life is difficult and a complicated jigsaw puzzle. It's been getting to me the last 3 or 4 months. I wonder what it's all for. Jack Ruby had 2 nightclubs and he became famous for shooting Oswald. Where does that leave me? I'm waiting for the mafia to move in and buy me out, he said, laughing. I'll get a yacht and a cook and be my chance to relax. Off to Jamaica. The party continued at the Zanzibar for the rest of the summer, but come autumn, an incident occurred at the club. It was so lurid not even Marty Reutemann could have anticipated it. It had been an otherwise unremarkable evening at Club Zanzibar on November 9th, 1971. The topless wrestlers were off for the night, so the quiet money crowd had to be satisfied instead with the bottomless dancers, like Miss Shelley, billed as Queen of the Strippers, who was on stage performing her final dance for the club's 30 or 40 patrons before closing time. Witnesses said later they'd seen one of the customers, a short, stocky man in his late 30s, sitting alone at his table, nursing a drink for about a half an hour. The man stood out. He wore a blonde wig. Others who got a closer look said he also wore a fake mustache. Miss Shelley gyrated on stage, an exciting conclusion to her act as the house drummer, who had accentuated her bumps and grinds with snare rolls and cymbal hits, now reached a tumultuous crescendo on his kit. Patrons hardly noticed the man in the wig walk calmly across the floor, kneel beside a cigarette machine, and fire 4 shots at the head of a man seated in front of him as the cymbals and drums crashed on stage. It was as if the man had timed the shooting perfectly. The pop of the .38 caliber pistol was almost drowned out by the cacophony. By those sitting closer to the table where the man had shot had screamed in horror. Heads turned. People at the bar who had been staring at their drinks suddenly bolted upright. They were shouting. Confusion erupted. No one got a good look enough at the man who in the blonde wig, who by that point had calmly walked out the front door, gotten into a pickup truck, and driven away. James Thomas Brennan, a 40-year-old man from Whitehorse, Yukon, lay dead with 2 bullets in his head. The 2 other men seated at nearby tables were also injured by a stray bullet each. The incident hit the front page of the following day's newspapers, and reporters noted the shooting mimicked the plot of an Alfred Hitchcock film, The Man Who Knew Too Much, in which the man tries unsuccessfully to shoot his victim as cymbals crash during a symphony concert. A man named William Harrigan, which is the gentleman there, who had performed as a snake dancer at the club with a 9-foot boa constrictor, said that Brennan had planned to become his manager. They had met each other 10 years earlier in Montreal, and Harrigan said they'd shared an apartment on Butte Street in Vancouver, near where Brennan worked as a steward in a local steam bath. This gets more lurid as this whole show it's so great. We went to the Zanzibar last night, and I told him I didn't like it, Harrigan said. I'm psychic. It seemed sort of strange, and he wanted to stay for a couple drinks. Premonitions aside, Harrigan could not help the police with any suspects or motives in Brennan's murder. The subsequent investigation did not indicate Brennan was killed for being a part of any sort of love triangle, and the crime left many unanswered questions. Had the killer seen Miss Shelley's act before? Did he rehearse the crime or know Shelley's act well enough for the drummer's finale to mask the shooting, or was it all a coincidence? Even the drummer was questioned by police. The following week, Stump Police offered a $1,000 reward for information leading to the arrest of the nightclub killer of James Thomas Brennan. The investigation into the murder of James Thomas Brennan remains a cold case for Vancouver homicide detectives. Strangely, it's not the only unsolved murder in Club Zanzibar's legacy. In December 1974, a waitress and go-go dancer at the club, Barbara Ann LaRocque, 22, went missing shortly after finishing her shift. 3 days later, her strangled body was found dumped in an area of North Langley. Business immediately soured after Brennan's murder. For a time, Reutemann considered selling all 3 of his nightclubs and getting into another line of work. It was one thing to put up with late nights and licensing headaches, but dealing with what seemed a professional hit was quite another. As the rain fell deeper into the winter of 1971, perhaps the idea of living in semi-retirement on a boat in Jamaica looked more appealing than ever. A month after the shooting, Zanzibar placed a notice in the papers that was altogether new. Far more stern and conservative than promotions in the past, the austere notice to patrons read that the Zanzibar would put no firearms on the premises. Before it closed for the final time, the Zanzibar would be the site of one last spectacle. On February 21st, 1977, after a late night working in the club, Reutemann decided to sleep in his second-story office. A city health inspector would be reporting to the club the next day for an appointment, so Reutemann wanted to supervise the morning cleaning staff and ensure that all went smoothly. He was joined that night by the club janitor, who later claimed he was too intoxicated to drive home and decided to sleep on an office couch. Reutemann would testify that he was wakened by the smell of smoke. He had tried to lead a janitor to the main floor exit, but was forced back by heavy smoke. He then smashed a window with a chair, yelled for help, and awaited rescue. When the fire department arrived, they found Reutemann yelling from the upper floor, the front doors, from the front window, upper floor window, and the front doors of the club were not only locked, but also chained and barred from the inside. So they had to use axes and chain cutters to get in. Reutemann and the janitor were rescued. Firemen later found a large quantity of barbecuing fire starter briquettes strewn around the cabaret and discovered that the office safe had been tampered with. It didn't take long for Reutemann himself to come under investigation. Police learned that the business had been insured for $359,000 and surmised that Reutemann had deliberately set fire to the building to collect on the policy. Charges were laid. Although there was a publication ban during the trial, details did leak out. At considerable expense, Reutemann had hired prominent Vancouver lawyer Alan McEachern, later appointed Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of British Columbia, to fight his case. McEachern asserted that there were others who could have set the fire, including a hot-tempered exotic dancer who stormed into the club one night after getting into a pay dispute with the management. According to witnesses, she had ripped a telephone off the wall, kicked in a door, and threatened to burn down the place. Reutemann took to the stand, claimed his innocence, claiming the cabaret was earning him $250,000 a year, and he'd be an idiot to get rid of what he considered a quote-unquote gold mine. How dumb would I have to be to try and burn down my place when I was in it, he said in his defense. Court said the fire was arson, but the Crown did not prove that Reutemann was the culprit, and he was acquitted in 1978. As for Reutemann, he never did make it to his getaway in Jamaica. He died on a plane accident in July 1980 when the Cessna he was piloting crashed on Bowen Island in Howe Sound near Vancouver. The place where the Torch Cabaret in the Zanzibar once stood is now home to the Cinematheque Art House Movie Theater. Film noir festivals and Fellini retrospectives have replaced the topless wrestlers and strippers on roller skates. The transition invariably leads one to reflect the goings-on at the old Zanzibar would have made one hell of a movie. There's other clubs like the Zanzibar, which of course started the Torch. They do change format. There was a club at 1036 Richards for a short period of time that had previously been the David Y.H. Louis Theater and later became the Laundromat for a very short period of time, about 1981. But long enough for DOA, our hometown heroes, to play there and record their sort of a landmark show, that's a punk rock show that's in Vancouver at the time that's considered. Within 9 years later, this is the scene outside of the place when it's Richards on Richards. And there had never really been a club sort of like Richards on Richards before in Vancouver that was sort of really geared that VIP. It really sort of catered to a new kind of Vancouverite. It was sort of expected to be treated maybe in a little bit different ways. And it's funny because Richards on Richards sort of occupies a place in time. I certainly remember going by it in teenagers and people used to make fun of the yuppies that sort of frequented the place. Maybe you were one of them. I don't mean to insult you. But there was a whole other cadre of people that thought, oh, I'm never going. I wouldn't be caught dead in that place. And the funny thing was, after those sort of 80s years of pastel clothing and Don Johnson suits ended, the club became a very sort of popular place for touring rock and roll shows. It was actually a great venue in which to see a band because the ceilings were nice and high, the stage was high, and losing it was kind of was a sad place. So even though it was a sort of a place in time, like the Love Affair at 1275 Richards, again a place that, or probably 1275 Seymour, excuse me, was also sort of occupies a place in time. But had you gone to 1275 Seymour in 1966 when it was the king of clubs, you would have seen, of course, a different kind of entertainment. So sometimes these places, although they are really well remembered, those buildings house different scenes and different music and different attitudes. So, the people that would have gone there in '66, or even people gone there later, when it was the Purple Steer, or after that the Garage, likely never have associated with the Love Affair crowd and whatnot. So sometimes these places do seemingly are a place in time. It'd be funny I've often, Love Affair is a very popular place and very oft sort of missed in Vancouverites of a certain age. It would be interesting to see if they could suddenly start it again. Would it be as successful, or was that sort of a place and time with that kind of music that was there? Where did, many people who expressed so much love for the Love Fair said it was really a place where the weird could go, and alternative people, it really was a home for that, and it was very welcoming for that. I don't know necessarily if the same, where does that alternative crowd go now? It's very much a different scene than it was, in the 80s and 90s, when the Love Fair finally was demolished in 2003. One of my favorite places, when I was just a wee rock and roller coming up in this city, was the Town Pump. And it was a great place. The Town Pump had actually started in 1971. This is a night an Art Bergman show. I think I'm in the crowd too. I've looked through that crowd and I think I can see my face in there, because God knows I went to a lot of Art Bergman shows. But again, I talk in the book with Matthew Good, a musician who talks about how the Town Pump was really the sort of the hub of the Vancouver rock and roll scene for a few years there, especially in the late 80s and early 90s. And had, to compare our city to Toronto, let's say, had the Horseshoe in Toronto closed, sort of almost an equivalent place, would the city have stood for it? It was in the mid to late 1990s, there was a real change going on in terms of live music venues, because you not only had, the costs were increasing, but also DJs were coming in, and it was an altogether different kind of place, like the DJs scene that began at Graceland at 1396 Richard Street. It's interesting to look back at that scene. It was probably the club actually opened in 1986, and in the book I speak with Vincent Alvaro, who was one of the guys who got some of the money together to buy the place. It opened just after Expo opened, and everybody told him, you're not going to get a liquor license. Because I guess there was a bit of a moratorium on any more liquor licensings being issued. There had been a bunch issued for Expo, but in the wake of that, they were sort of clamping them down and not looking at any new ones for at least until the new year. And you need a liquor license to run a club in Vancouver, and he was wondering what he was going to do. It turns out he was friends with the son of Grace McCarthy, and there's Grace there with Expo Ernie. And it turns out Grace did a little bit of backroom, behind the scenes investigation and eventually got them the liquor license. And he said, Aaron, I've never told this before, but the reason we called it Gracelands is because of Grace McCarthy. So all the people that were raving there that night on E and really getting drunk and having a great time can all thank a social credit cabinet minister for all the good times they had. I suppose Cave is demolished in '81. It's a very evocative photo from the Vancouver Sun. So many clubs have gone, not just to, sort of fire and mismanagement, essentially to real estate. What essentially happened in the early 2000s in Vancouver was the establishment of the Granville Entertainment District, where the city really tried to sort of urge and sort of push some of the clubs onto Granville. So some of the places like the Quadra Club, later the Starfish Room, some people might remember as Club Soda, closed and were rezoned residential because that land was simply more valuable for condos than it was, as simply as a nightclub property, a 1 or 2 story building. It's safe to say, I think, had the Commodore not been on Granville Street, it would have gone too. There would have been a big furor about it, but we lost the Cave. We've lost these other places that had just as a rich history in their own way before they ended their time. And another thing that's really affecting probably the future of the nightclub business is, of course, the internet. God knows these days it's very easy to be a hermit these days, thanks to Facebook, and you don't have to see your friends. Thanks to Netflix, you got things to watch. Thanks to Uber Eats, you don't have to go out. You can order in from your favorite restaurant, and you can become your own bargain basement Howard Hughes these days, and never have to see anybody if you want. And it's also expensive to go out. The days of going out, like Denny Boyd said, with $20 and having a night on the town, of course you can't do that anymore in Vancouver. So nightclub owners, of course, the present lot are dealing with all those things. We've done a very good job of bringing the new into Vancouver, but we haven't done maybe the best job of keeping the old, is something that I always say. And just as we have with so many other places in Vancouver that we sort of missed, or buildings that we sort of miss aren't there, whether they're business or residential. The nightclubs have always been a really important part of our history. And you know, when the clubs disappear, so goes part of the city's DNA, I like to say. You know, what's important about these places is not just, of course, the stars and the entertainment and the talent that played some of these clubs, but it's where we went to as Vancouverites. It's where we met. And there's very few places that are cross-generational in Vancouver, a place that maybe your grandparents could go to, you know, your parents went to, and you could go to. Practically name them on one hand. Stanley Park, the P&E, the Orpheum maybe, the Commodore, Penthouse in a weird way. But after that, I'm not kidding, it's true, it's there, you know. But we have very few places that, and no city is supposed to be a museum. You know, cities are supposed to change. I would have been horrified had Vancouver just simply remained in 1974 and never changed from that. Some of the changes in Vancouver I think have been good and been proper. And as I say, cities aren't museums and are, you know, they're supposed to change. But if we can do something to try to help the nightclub businesses with some of the challenges they face, and I think it would be beneficial for the city to do, or you know, to do so. But I always say that I remain positive that the great days of Vancouver nightclubs are not over. The one thing about glory days is they always tend to change with each generation. Almost everybody I interviewed talked about, well, you know, the people that had it before us never had it as good as us, and the people that after us, they all missed out. And funny enough, people's glory days are kind of right between after leave high school and get married. You know, that follows every generation, no matter who you are. The music changes, the taste change, the fashions change, you know, and there's great moments, you know, but if you were to ask anybody who was, you know, involved in the nightclub industry and the nightclub scene, really depend who you're talking to and what their age. Some people would say the Cave. Some people would said my days were at the Smiling Buddha in the 1970s. For somebody like me, it was at the Town Pump in the 90s and whatnot. So our nightclub history in Vancouver changes that way. It's also a moving target because the scenes have changed. Hornby Street is no more. Gastown's kind of coming back again. Commercial Drive is now a place where there used to be clubs. In the 1990s, there wasn't really any place. It was really open late to catch some music or anything like that. And that's all that's all changing now. What the future will bring, well, there are new clubs that have opened up, and they're building on their history. Every new night of the week they have shows there and have new people in. The Rickshaw Theatre is a great example of that. The Little Imperial Theatre around the corner as well. There's some smaller places that when I was working on the book, I was out on a date one night and somebody took me to a place called the Clubhouse. It was just on 1st and Main, and there were a bunch of people in their 20s going to see live music. Almost a tear came to my eye. I thought, you know, the music's in good hands here and whatnot. So times change and whatnot, and the nightclub history changes in terms of its music and where it is. And it's very easy for somebody to come back who've been out of town for a while and say, well, all the clubs are gone. I went down to Hornby Street, I didn't see anything. I went down to, you know, Granville Street. It's not for me. It's just a bunch of 20-year-olds. As I say, it's a constantly sort of a moving target that way. That was Trader Vic's, of course, as well, that was barged away and is now in somebody's backyard in Vancouver Island. It's a shame because, you know, of course, maybe the Hawaiian shirt cocktail culture thing had been waning for a while, and somebody bought it, and it was barged away dramatically out where we'd never see it again. And just within a couple years later, the whole cocktail culture came back, and arguably Trader Vic's would have made a killing maybe those years. So timing is crucial. For the future, you know, the city is going to keep changing, and while some places like the Commodore that are on Granville Street, where that entertainment district is, may remain safe in there, but there's by no means anything is supposed to necessarily is guaranteed to last forever. The rents that are keeping the increase in these places prevent another thing. The reason why some place like the Penthouse is still there is because the Filipponi family owns it. They don't have to pay rent for that. The Commodore isn't so lucky. By no means is its future as certain. So, you know, people say, what's next? I don't know. The West End will probably look more and more like Yaletown. Falls Creek will look more and more like the West End, I think. Hastings Street's probably going to stay the same. And eventually we'll have a big earthquake, and we'll clear the monopoly board off of all the pieces, and we'll start again, I suppose. I hope that when we do start again, they may be able to use Vancouver After Dark as a user manual on how to run and how not to run a nightclub. Thank you for your time.